Good evening, everyone. My name is Antonio Martez, and I am the co-chairman for health and wellness for Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated. And today we have a very, very interesting discussion on clinical studies. And clinical studies is a very, very important topic, which surrounds what's called precision medicine. And what precision medicine is the customization of healthcare, a more tailored approach similar to, say, in eyeglasses. My eyeglasses very well may not work for you or anyone else. It's necessarily custom and tailored for myself. So today we want to talk about the importance of getting African Americans involved with clinical trial participation and the challenges that lies in the negative stigmas in regards to getting involved with clinical studies. And so today with me is a good brother of mine, Dr. Adrian Douglas, who I know extremely well. Dr. Douglas is a chartering member for the alumni chapter that I'm currently the president of, which is the Stone Mountain Lithonia alumni chapter, and he is also a chartering member for the alumni chapter that he is involved with, which is the Lawrenceville Duluth alumni chapter. Dr. Douglas will introduce himself as well as give some of the things as to why he believes African American participation in clinical trials is lower and how we can close the gap with regards to getting African Americans involved to remove some of the health disparities for Black people. So, with that said, Dr. Douglas, welcome.
Thank you so much, Brother Martez. Appreciate it so much for having me as a speaker today. I'd also like to thank Black Health Matters in terms of also extending the opportunity for me to take part in this most important topic. Again, my name is Dr. Adrian C. Douglas. I'm a board certified internist. I originate from a small town in eastern North Carolina, Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And I went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I went to undergrad and medical school before making my transition to the city of Atlanta, where I completed my residency at Emory University. For the last 25 years, I've been on staff at Piedmont Hospital. And at present, I am in the position of practicing with MD VIP, which is a personalized concierge practice, nationally recognized, but more specifically located at Piedmont Hospital in Atlanta, in addition to other areas. Go ahead, brother.
No, no. So, Dr. Douglas, I know you and I, we've had the opportunity to talk about this very subject in front of our chapter, and the importance of getting involved. And so, like I mentioned, just give us your opinion on what you believe as why you believe that participating in clinical trial research can help close the gap and disparities for Black people.
Well, one thing is for sure. In North America, people of African descent, carry the largest burden of health disparities, and particularly have a large burden of health illnesses as compared to other subgroups. In particular, when you look at conditions such as hypertension, diabetes, the different malignancies, particularly as it pertains to men of African descent, prostate cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, all these different conditions, which frequently are found to be more commonly severe and a lot of times more advanced when they're found in individuals of African descent. So it's so important that we really wrap around this topic and get involved in any way that we can in terms of research. There is nuances and differences in all of us. Yes, we're in this great human race, but there are different families, and there are different, groups and cousins of individuals. So people of African descent originating from the African continent, they have some differences from people of European descent, from people which are of Pacific Island descent or Asian, and people of Latin descent also too. Because we're in North America, as you know, and there are a number of us that carry a number of different genetic backgrounds, and a lot of it has been mixed because of our experience in North America. But we need to take part because we, as a group, have the vast burden of illnesses. And if we're not involved in a lot of the clinical trials, then the medications, the treatments, well, we're really depending on other groups And we really need to have it based on our own experiences in our own bodies, which again are a little bit different from other groups.
So so the one size fits all theory, I guess they're really, as it relates to healthcare, because we're talking about it being more individualized, and what very well may work for someone of European descent may not very well work for someone of African descent. So that takes out the one size fits all, which is basically how medicine is evolved right now. So, with all that said, what does that mean? Can you give us some examples of why knowing more about genetics and our race that informs medical treatments and outcomes? And I understand that you do have some slides that you sent over, so I'll go ahead and share those for you. Just 1 second, let me pull them up. One second. Sorry about that. It's not sharing. 1 second. Let me pull it back. Here we go. All right. Can you see my screen?
I'm not able to see it presently, but I can just say that, we should participate because things work differently. I mean, there's just so much that's different in regards to various groups. People of African descent tend to have a high risk of cardiovascular disease, much higher and much more severe than in people of European descent. We tend to have a high burden in regards to diabetic disease, primarily associated with our increased BMI. As mentioned in the slides, 87% of individuals of Latinx descent and also Asian and Black Americans have a higher risk of having tuberculosis, or the percentage is higher than people of European descent. Women of Latin descent tend to have a higher risk of certain cancers, such as cervical cancer, and then they tend to have a higher mortality rate or morbidity rate because of this. So we've got to get everybody involved. People of Asian descent tend to have a higher risk of gastric cancer, hepatitis B, and certainly tuberculosis. And some of that has to do with the circumstances in which all of us live here in America.
Okay. So, I mean, those are very good specific percentages that really help to at least give you a large insight as to, from a percentage standpoint, how it affects African Americans compared to other races. Now, just jumping right into clinical trials, can you help define what clinical trials is?
Well, it's really a study. I mean, we're studying. We can't make the assumption, or we can't generalize that, again, what works in one group works in another group. And so by having research, we get studies in which we design it so that we can figure out whether or not it works the same way, figure out how it works, whether or not there are any type of side effects, any type of problems with symptoms, and whether or not there's anything otherwise that we can add on. Historically, again, the vast majority of the clinical trials in which I trained and learned in the 80s were based on primarily men of European descent, not even necessarily women. So that's yet another component. Gender also should be a component, and also age. Recently, we found out about the differences in certain illnesses in younger individuals versus being in older individuals. And so we need to have everyone involved. So when we have these trials, we're doing a volunteer study in which people are asked to participate, and it is designed such that we can figure out exactly how things work. We inform people about it, and so we tell them exactly what's going on, and we have oversight, which is much different from perhaps what a lot of people in history of some of the healthcare events that African Americans have been involved in. So safety is the main thing that we should take away. But the goal is to find better and newer treatments. And the only way we can do that is to take part in trials.
So, and taking part in trials is I'm sure the difficult part, especially with the disparities that African Americans experience, and I'm sure there's a large variance because of for whatever reasons. Can you share just some of the facts around health disparities and inequities in African Americans health and how this relates to clinical research?
Well, inequities, as mentioned, we carry such a high burden. And a lot of that has to do with access to care, which understandably we're working more and more on that in recent years. Hopefully we'll get more of that presently with the environment that we're in. And so with that access to care, then we hope that that will help to lower the burden and outcomes that we've been challenged with over years. But also, we're also having more and more individuals of color going into healthcare. And so entering into healthcare in the form of physicians, nurses, pharmacists, physical therapists, occupational therapists, all these type of individuals are able to, based on their collective experience, which may be unique because of the communities that they're in, put their minds together and come up with clinical trials. So it's so important, that we work on clinical trials to try to help. So clinical trials sometimes can even help in terms of, closing that gap. When you are in a clinical trial, understand that often enough, you're going to get treatment. You are going to get treatment. Now, with a clinical trial, sometimes the treatments are going to be placebo, or that may be what's presently being used, or it may be, in fact, something that is being researched. But when you do that, then you get a chance to be watched and monitored by doctors in training, doctors who are research experts, who are dealing with doctors all around the world. So there's so many benefits to being involved in clinical trials.
So, one of the key words in clinical trials is diversity, and diversity not necessarily only targeting African Americans, because although we have a low percentage in participation with regards to clinical trials, there's other ethnicity groups that are even lower. For example, Hispanics, Asians, Alaskans, Indians, they're extremely low as well as it relates to clinical trials and research. Considering how much of a hot topic that diversity is, why is diversity so important for clinical research and the advancement of medicine?
Well, clinical research and certainly the advancement of medicine, particularly as it pertains to the different ethnic groups. So as we mentioned before, people of African descent carry a high burden, but as a rule, over 80% of clinical trial participation are people of European descent. So again, for the longest time, we have been generalizing healthcare based on people of European descent. There are differences. They're just subtle differences that we know. And certainly I note as a physician, and those things need to be incorporated in the type of treatment plans, medications, therapies, whatever they may be that we provide to people. So we have to have a little bit of everybody. We have to have, if you will, the rainbow and of all the different people of the different backgrounds in clinical trials.
So, and as I mentioned, I mean, you could take a look at the clinical trial by participation by race. As like you mentioned, the where it shows the 78%, that signifies whites, and then where it shows 16% is for African Americans, and like I mentioned before, other and American Indian and Alaska Natives, they show an even lower percentage. So, to your point, the importance of getting involved is extremely important to the topic and to the point of what precision medicine is looking to do, getting a more tailorized result for it. And it helps to eliminate what's called imprecise medicine, which, as a physician, I'm sure that if you've prescribed a remedy to a patient and it didn't necessarily sit well with them, and the time it takes to prescribe another remedy and another remedy and another remedy because the original one didn't work, well, that's imprecise medicine. That's adding more time to getting the best option for that particular patient. And it's more and more important reasons why it's so much more important to get involved patients to get involved with regards to precision medicine.
Absolutely.
Now, As far as clinical trials go, and again, this is another slide showing the clinical trial participation by ethnicity. As far as clinical trials go, what are some types of clinical trials?
Well, you can do screening clinical trials. That's a trial when we're screening for a disease, then the individual doesn't have a disease clinically. So we're trying to catch a disease before it becomes clinical in the earliest stages. I think everyone understands the concept of disease, and that if you catch it early, particularly as we talk about cancer before it spreads, then the outcomes are going to be better. So screening tests are used to try to catch diseases before they become clinically obvious. So screening trials. You have therapeutic trials, obviously, to determine whether or not there's a difference in therapy. There's therapies that are present right now. We want to know whether or not some new therapies are effective. Example, we're presently using blood pressure medications. A number of people may talk about using natural ways of dealing with blood pressure. So how do we figure that out? Whether or not that's something that we can really advocate, we do a clinical trial. In that situation, we may have someone on a standard medicine of whatever it is, let's say blood pressure medicine, and then we may have someone else taking something, if you will, that is natural and not necessarily a medication that has been metabolized or produced. So, and we set a planned time that we're going to watch people, and then we measure it to see what the outcomes are. So there can be treatment trials. There can be, if you will, trials in which individuals may also have evaluations, and particularly when we're trying to make a diagnostic trial. In other words, X-rays, versus a CT scan. So for the longest time, in terms of diagnostics, lung cancer was diagnosed with the simple chest X-ray. About a decade ago, it was decided that if we do a low-dose CT scan for an individual over the age of 55 up to the age of 79 in someone that has smoked at least a pack of cigarettes for 30 years, then we're very likely to be able to catch an early cancer at an early stage where we can take care of it in the form of surgery. Surgery being primarily the cure that we're looking for. So that was an evaluation type of a trial, whereas we had previously been finding lung cancers on X-rays, or the question was, should we continue to do just X-rays or should we use CT scans? So we use CT scans, primarily. That's the best test. And that was answered by being in that type of trial. So there are a lot of different trials also.
So I advanced your presentation that you sent over, and it looks like what's called phases of clinical trials.
Yeah.
What are phases of clinical trials? Can you just give us just an overview of the phase itself, the phases itself?
Yeah. So you go from phase 1 to phase 4. Phase 1 is usually a small trial in which you may have 0 to 50 individuals. And it usually starts with trying to figure out, whether or not the medication or the treatment is safe. So at that point, you only have a limited number of participants, and most of them are healthy. When you get to phase 2, that's when you start to get a larger group, maybe 100 to 50. And then we start to talk about more, again, is it safe? What are the side effects? What might be the efficacy of it? Whether or not, your body metabolizes it different from the next person, whether or not you absorb it or excrete it different from the next person. And then also, again, whether or not there's any type of reactions that may occur from it. And then when you get to, phase 3, then you start talking about a much larger group of people, maybe up to 500 to 1,000 individuals. And we're still trying to figure out about side effects, whether or not it's safe, whether or not it works. And also we start to comparing it to what the standard of care is. And finally, stage 4 is after the medication has been released. And sometimes, we just find out interesting thing about medicines after they've been released, after they've been out there on the market for a number of years. They've passed the clinical trials, but we just learned some interesting things about the medicines by continuing to have people take part in trials where we monitor them, monitor their outcomes, monitor their bodies, things along that line.
Wow. And so, wow, that's Thank you for breaking it down. So, as it relates to the fear and the history behind the mistrust in clinical trials, and like I mentioned in the beginning, I work as the liaison for the All of Us Research Program on behalf of the fraternity, and so I do have the opportunity to speak to the underrepresented population on their idea of clinical studies, and I always hear things like Henrietta Lacks and the Tuskegee Project and some of those things. Can you talk about the history and the mistrust in clinical trials and why people are so apprehensive in getting involved with clinical trials?
Well, you made some comments, as I think the most egregious, abuse of individuals in terms of clinical trials, particularly in North America, and there were other things that were done in Europe by the Nazis that were egregious also too. But the fact that in America, there were a group of individuals of African descent men who had, contracted syphilis and were not treated completely and were
Wow.
monitored for over 40 years. And
Mm,
this was sanctioned by, the United States government. This went on all the way up until the 70s, from the 30s. So this is probably the root of a lot of the different mistrust that we even hear now, because of that. So can you imagine? This was also taken part by physicians. So I mean, these are individuals that had made a vow, if you will, Hippocratic oath, but they didn't follow through with that when it came to individuals of African descent. So there is a lot to this. I mean, I understand. In present times right now, with the challenge that we have globally, there being mistrust
mm,
about what is considered the best options for people of
right.
African descent. Um, this time that we just came through in 2020 with the whole idea of misinformation, whatever that may have come from, whomever that may have come from, I understand that. When you talk about the idea of a Mississippi appendectomy, what
Mm,
is that? Mississippi appendectomy. That just wasn't in Mississippi. Now, I hail from North Carolina, and I'm proud to be a Tar Heel, but I was shocked to know that the state of North Carolina, in fact, took part in this type of behavior. Now, what is a Mississippi appendectomy? Unfortunately, it was a situation where women of African descent primarily were led to believe that they were getting an appendectomy, but what was actually happening was that they were actually getting a hysterectomy so that
wow.
they were no longer able to reproduce. And that was sanctioned by the state. So there's a lot. There's a whole lot about the challenge, if you will, that we descendants of the African slaves have had to endure in North America. I mean that's just a whole nother topic. That's a whole nother hour, dear brother. But nonetheless, we still continue on, and we have to know that now with clinical trials, they are being monitored by
Mm,
individuals, by review boards, which are making sure that everything is ethically sound. And in addition, and similar to so many other things, we are in those rooms now. So
mm,
whereas before we were not in the rooms, now we have esteemed institutions like Morehouse School of Medicine, which the focus is primarily producing doctors who are previously underrepresented.
mm,
They are taking part in trials, in other ones like Harry and Howard University and other medical schools around the country. So that we are there, we're producing the new scientists. They're being produced in those same institutions, and so the climate is different. The climate is different. So this idea of staying woke, where we're staying woke, we're in the rooms. We're actually putting together some of the trials, and so it is a different environment. But nonetheless, when you look at some of the things that are just going on, which again, we're going to keep it straight about healthcare
mm,
in North America right now, then
right.
you understand. So as a physician, my ministry is to talk to my patients, talk to them, one on one as much as I can, to try to, to get around this fear, to try to get around this mistrust. I need to try to approach them as an ally and someone of similar background in terms of my knowledge, my respect, and my understanding, and my trust in the system as it is right now. So, but yet it is still some work to be done, good brother.
Absolutely. And so, and one of the things that I typically hear when I have this discussion, based upon the fear, is that they don't want to necessarily be a lab rat. And I think that definitely comes from the historics and the history behind just that fear and that negative stigma, like you mentioned. But just like technology has evolved, so has healthcare. And so if we're not necessarily involved and or have a seat at the table, similar to elections, if we're not voting, then our voice isn't heard. If we're not getting involved with clinical studies and getting in and letting those studies distinguish the differences between our genetics, our lifestyles, our environment, our backgrounds, then medicine is going to continue to be developed for for people that don't necessarily look like us, and it's just really not going to benefit us for different remedies, as you mentioned. So, what can the health community? I know you mentioned your ministry as a doctor, being speaking to your patients and educating them on the importance. What can the health community do to engage in communities of color with regards to clinical trials?
Certainly, making a conscious effort to direct advertisement towards communities wherever we may be. Mm-hmm. So one place that recently there has been a breakthrough in terms of comfort in regards to treatments that are being provided at the present time during this global pandemic is through the Black church. So partnering with the Black church, that's something that that we've seen has also helped in a number of ways. Most recently, in terms of some of the things that we've done on a national level, it's been with the support. The Black church has always been the haven of safety. That is one of the places in which we've always gone to in terms of time to think about things and to plan things and to get a good understanding. I continue to enjoy looking at things on television about the civil rights era and the people during that time meeting in the Black church to plan things, to understand things, to strategize. So certainly a partnership with the African American church would be something that would be of benefit. As you and I, men of Kappa Alpha Psi, continuing to work with the Divine Nine and the Greeks in a number of different ways, getting their support. Again, the participation in all of us, from all of the Greeks, the Divine Nine, that's a way in which we can continue to get individuals involved of African descent, involved in various clinical trials. Those are the big things that I would think would be of importance in terms of trying to help. Also giving some form of incentive. So let's just say the idea of blood transfusion. There's a lot of blood that's needed. All right. So for a number of individuals, particularly individuals that are in college, they may end up donating blood. Now they're going to donate blood. Well, they may get $50. They may get something. So some type of incentive of somehow. It may not necessarily need to be monetary. It may be something else creative. But what can we do to help people? And how can we get them to be more motivated? Well, usually, besides the long-term benefit of participating in the trial, now that's something that's going to be strategic down the road in years from the tactical standpoint, short-term. So that's, in other words, what am I going to get out of this? And so, yeah, some form of incentive might be of benefit. I'll leave that to the pharmaceutical companies, which certainly are innovative, to say the least, in terms of what to do in that regards.
Thank you for that. That's that you brought up some great points. Yes, the Divine Nine is definitely involved with regards to educating our community and our communities and those underrepresented. But not only that, with regards to the All of Us Research Program, there are other community organizations as well. The National Baptist Convention is one. where churches are involved, Asians organizations, LGBTQ. Every voice in the with regards to the program is the voice is out and educating people on the importance of clinical studies. But I do want to bring your attention to and also a site where you can learn more and get more information on clinical research and the importance of diversity. If you could see the screen, you see that it is an extremely diverse audience. To get more information on the importance of diversity in clinical trials, please visit www.researchincludesme.com. Again, that's researchincludesme.com. And that would definitely give you an idea of and just some more information as it relates to the importance of diversity in clinical studies. And so also for additional resources and just overall wellness information on different wellness topics, please visit blackhealthmatters.com and subscribe. They do send out a great newsletter on a periodic basis, and it's very informative on different things, different health remedies, different diets, and different paths you could take from a health standpoint. So as it relates to our audience today, I just want to thank you for your time participating with us today on this very important topic. I would also like to thank Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated and the Metropolitan Atlanta Coalition of Kappas, as well as the Southeastern Province and Black Health Matters. We're going to go ahead and answer a couple of questions that very well may have come. So let me see. Do we have any questions in the chat? Let me take a look. Let me see. So Dr. Douglas, let me scan this and see if we have any questions that we can address. There's a question. Let me see 1 second. Does the location of clinical trials make a difference?
I don't think that makes a difference. Again, I'm not exactly sure that I understand the nature of that question. The location as in different countries, as in, different cities, different states. I can tell you the participation, let's just say regionally. All right. So the vast majority of people of African descent live in the Southeast, the vast majority. Why? Because they were respectfully the states which held the largest amount of African slaves. So we in healthcare call this area from Louisiana to North Carolina the stroke belt. Why is it called the stroke belt? Well, because there is a high prevalence and incidence of hypertension being the primary cause for strokes. So if you were to do a study on hypertension, then ideally, where would be the best place to do it? The best place would be in the South. Would be in the South. Not to say that you couldn't have it in the Northeast because of the Great Migration. You're going to find people in Chicago. You're going to find people of African descent in Boston. You're going to find people who made the migration west. So yeah, but you're certainly going to have a core. You're going to have a core of your participants, particularly as it pertains to individuals of African descent, to be in the Southeast. So if you will, the formal states of the Confederacy, because that's where the vast majority of us still live. Amazingly enough, we are witnessing the reverse migration. People are coming back to the cities of the South, right, to the Atlantas, to the Charlottes, to the Nashvilles. So you would want to have it probably in the Southeast as it pertains to specific conditions that impact greatly people of African descent. So I would suspect that location does mean a lot in that manner.
So here's another question for you. Does the lack of participation leave African Americans vulnerable in some way? And I know we talked about that from an imprecise medicine standpoint. But just your view as far as the lack of participation and how it leaves African Americans vulnerable.
Well, I mean, we cannot, if you will, generalize. For so long, conditions, in terms of the treatments that we provided to individuals of all backgrounds was generalized based on European men of European descent. And we just found out we can't do that. As a prime example, there is a medication that was found in research from back during my training. It's under the name of Bidil, and that's under another pharmaceutical company, but nonetheless, that it was a medicine that we had used individually for a long time. Come to find out that it's a medicine that specifically helps individuals of African descent in advanced heart failure.
Wow.
So without the research in African Americans, then, we wouldn't know that. We wouldn't have known that this particular medicine that we've been, for the most part, putting off to the side. I mean, this is stuff that's been out since the 70s and 80s, but when used in combination, it was found to be effective. So it was yet another way of treating specifically individuals of African descent and heart failure, yet something else. Because sometimes with heart failure and with any failure, we get to the point where we don't have too much more to offer. So now, because of the specific participation of African Americans in this particular study for this medication, which was a standard medication that had been out for many years, we found out that we are uniquely responsive to this combination of medicines for heart failure. So let's say if we didn't have that, then there would be a number of people that would have had poor outcomes, that would have had probably episodes of heart failure. Heart failure is where your heart, doesn't work, start to back up with fluid, shortness of breath, swelling in the legs, all the things that go with that. And so eventually that can lead to people passing on. By the research, this medication has helped the quality of life of individuals of African descent, and it also has helped with extending lives in people who, in some situations, have an end-stage disease, an incurable disease called heart failure. So, yes.
Thank you. So another question. How long does participation in a clinical trial usually last? I know it varies, but from just from an average standpoint, how frequent are the appointments, clinical visits, weekly, monthly? Are they prescribed medications? Just from your knowledge standpoint with regards to it, how long do they typically last, and the periodic, I guess, how periodically do you have to go in for, I guess, to be evaluated?
Well, it's all different for one. So like a prime example of a clinical trial, remember, was the Tuskegee. That lasted 40 years. So, you've got trials that can last for such a long time, 10 and 20 years. So it's variable, but a lot of times most trials, I would say, last about 5 years or so. In that time, enough data is put together to make a decision. It depends on the principal investigator. You may end up having to come in once a month to get your labs checked, to get examinations. Depends on, what they find. If they find that something has changed, that someone is having a change in their liver function or kidney function, they may ask you to come in sooner. If your blood counts change, they may ask you to come in sooner. So all that's variable. It can be variable in terms of how frequent. But a lot of times, let's get back to taking part in clinical trials. Clinical trials, you get an informed consent. Informed consent means that they sit you down and they talk to you about what this trial is and what to expect. How often are you going to need to come in to get tested? Whether or not you need to, take this medication. Whether or not, you can stop at a certain point in time. What are they expecting to find? Who else is going to be participating in it? Those type of things. And so you get informed. Remember, it's voluntary. So at any point in time, individuals can stop at any point in time. No one can hold you captive once you get in a clinical trial. It's up to you. For whatever reason, if something that changes in your life, then you can stop taking part in it. So again, it is something that can be, it's a lot of variation in clinical trials, but one can expect, that, it can be accelerated, most recently with what we're dealing with, understandably, with the global pandemic, clinical trials, have moved rapidly. And that's based on previous, information that we had from previous, viruses from years gone by. So it can be a lot. It can be a lot of difference. But do expect that you will have to come in and get checked. You would have to take part in, screenings. And what are the benefits of it? You may, in fact, be able, well, you will be, getting some type of monitoring. Whereas for some people who may not have had any type of health care at all, you're getting seen by a doctor, you're getting seen by a nurse practitioner, you're getting seen by a PA, you're getting followed by a nurse, you're getting medicines from a pharmacist. So there's benefits to it. There's certainly benefits to it. And a lot of times you may be getting treated with what's, going to be a cutting edge therapy. You may be the first one that gets it, and it really works out. So in other words, you may get access to something that you wouldn't ordinarily have access to.
So I know you mentioned the informed consent with regards to it, and I know one one area of concern with regards to clinical studies is security and of the information with regards to the customers. I'm sorry, to the patient's private information as it relates to clinical studies and clinical trials. Is the individual primary care physician involved in this, and is there the patient's information sent over to the primary care physician for review and maybe discussion with the patient at all?
At some point, I think one has to sign a consent to be able to release the information to your primary care doctor. And certainly at a certain point with the outcome of the study, then the primary care doctor should be able to discuss it with the patient. But a lot of that information is really the responsibility of the primary investigator, or whoever that person designates to be their person to be the chief information officer, if I can use that term, in terms of getting the information out. And the primary care doctor might be able to say, hey, you've got a condition here. I'm looking up and I noticed that, Emory University or Morehouse School of Medicine is having a clinical trial. I think that you may be a good participant based on your history. We get an opportunity to be followed by the academicians, these individuals who've trained all around the world, who have come for where you and I are right now in Atlanta or wherever it may be to study and to be educated. And so you're going to be watched closely. You're going to be able to get tests and things that you may not be able to get on an otherwise basis, on a regular basis. So, all these different, benefits from taking part in clinical trials.
As it relates to clinical trials, and we know there are a ton of clinical trials just based on medical research. From your opinion standpoint, what would be, say, the top 3 clinical trials you would recommend African Americans to get involved with?
Well, when we start talking about, cancers of various sorts, so for men of African descent, prostate cancer clinical trials, for women, breast cancer clinical trials, because women of African descent have a risk of this, cancer, in which they have a high risk of early, if you will, development and severe advanced progression rapidly. It's called triple negative breast cancer. And so those are the things that I think that certainly we should consider taking part in. Cardiovascular disease. Again, we have a high burden. Why? Because for our people of African descent, we carry the foundations at a much higher rate of cardiovascular disease than other communities. What are the foundations? Diabetes mellitus, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and an elevated body mass index. In other words, overweight or obesity. All of those are the pillars for cardiovascular disease. So that leads to increased, illness in our community at a lot earlier point in time and a lot severer than other communities. So,
What about prostate cancer, in your opinion?
Particularly prostate cancer. So you men of African descent in North America have the highest risk of prostate cancer.
Mm,
We start to have prostate cancer at much earlier ages
right,
than other individuals. So I would submit that certainly by the age of 40, all men of African descent should have had begun the process of prostate cancer screening. I
right,
know there can be a point of contention in regards to the digital rectal exam, but nonetheless, a PSA at a minimum, that's the blood test,
right.
should be done beginning around the age of 40. And depending on your family history, particularly if you have a family history of prostate cancer, then you may, in fact, want to do that 10 years younger than the earliest age. So, for an individual that unfortunately has prostate cancer at 43, then I would recommend that their son get checked by 33.
Right.
Start to get that PSA checked 10 years ahead of time because there may, in fact, be a genetic component, and there is a genetic component. There's just certain genes that we have identified that increase our risk. And so the whole idea of this precision medicine is that we have a map. Can you imagine that? A map of the genetic
Mm,
material. We have a master plan of the
right.
genetic material that we can take a look at and figure out which gene, which chromosome is causing this particular condition. So
Wow.
with precision medicine, in years to come, the engineers, the chemical engineers, the biological engineers, the computer engineers, the medical engineers, they're going to be able to delete that gene, take it out. They're going to be able to remove it. They're going to be able to, right now, with certain therapies, particularly in oncology, they're using genetics. They're doing gene studies to figure out which medications to use to help as compared to other individuals. So there's so much on the horizon, and it still comes down to individuals of color. Tonight, the focus is of men of African descent as it pertains to, certainly prostate cancer participation. But I would submit everybody, needs to kind of step up their participation because for the longest time in the world, not just North America, but in the world, healthcare has been based on individuals of European genetic ancestry.
Mm,
And again, we're all in this family, but we're a little bit different. We're a little different. And so
absolutely.
that's so important in terms of the outcomes and how we engineer the therapy that we're going to give to people going into the future.
Is there a benefit to participating in clinical trials if you have cancer?
Yes, yes. A lot of times, some of the cutting edge tests and treatments come out of clinical trials. A lot of times, in regards to individuals that we have exhausted all of the traditional treatments, whatever that may be, what are some of the traditional treatments? They can be in the form of chemotherapy. I think everybody recognizes that,
Hmm.
radiotherapy or radiation therapy. All those things sometimes can be exhausted, and yet we have to start looking for other ways of treating people. So then we get into, genetics, cryotherapy, cryo being something where something is actually frozen, laser therapy. A lot of times these things are options that we have. And for someone that has gotten, if you will, advanced cancer, and the doctors are saying we've done everything we can, but I found out about this important, if you will, research study that's going on up at Howard University School of Medicine, and it seems like it may be something that can give us some hope. Then yeah, there are benefits. There are benefits in terms of taking part in clinical trials, particularly when you have cancers. And it may not necessarily be at advanced stage. It may be just the idea of early stage cancers and finding yet another way of treating it without causing any of the side effects that may come from the traditional treatments, which historically have been chemotherapy and radiation therapy.
How does one enroll in clinical research or clinical trials?
Well, There's a number of different ways you can do that. One, talking with your primary care provider. That's one. Two, you can Google almost everything in life these days. So you can Google clinical trials near me. Three, you can certainly call, institutions of higher learning. So the different medical schools and different universities. Four, you can certainly look up different pharmaceutical companies, which are constantly looking for participants to enroll in clinical trials. There are so many different ways, but there are simple ways of doing it, and there are more, if you will, more advanced ways of doing it. But the information is there, and again, in this time of availability, as simple as Googling things or doing a search for clinical trials, putting in, different, if you will, pharmaceutical companies, putting in different universities, different medical schools, different organizations. Those things can bring up a lot of information about participating in clinical trials. But again, a lot of times, who is the person that is your consultant? Who is your healthcare project manager? If you will, who is your chief medical officer on your personal board? Then that's going to be your primary care doctor. So that might be the first person that you go to. And a lot of times that relationship can be intimate to the point of, trust and to the point of being similar almost to a relationship that you may have with other people very close to you, such as your attorney or your minister, professional, confidential, but yet, informative, and, someone that you trust.
So in clinical trials, I know typically the experimental drug that they're working on, I know they give that to you. From a financial standpoint, is there any financial compensation that comes with clinical trials as well?
Frequently enough, participation in clinical trials, there can be financial compensation. Again, that there are resources, and particularly with the pharmaceutical companies, as we know, they do have the resources. Universities have the resources. A lot of times they may get federal grants, from the federal government, from the NIH to do certain research. A part of that budget may be some type of stipend. Let's say for someone who is a demographic that we need to take part in the clinical trial. Let's say they don't live in the city of Atlanta. Let's say they live in Georgia. Well, who's going to pay for that gas? Who's going to pay for that gas for them to get down to the clinical trial? A lot of times, the participants, the primary investigator, and the different companies and organizations that take part in clinical trials may provide some form of monetary compensation to take part in it, or either at least reimbursement for some of the potential cost outcomes or cost overlays that may come by taking part in the clinical trials. But frequently enough, there can be opportunities for compensation.
So, can you take out insurance to protect yourself? Should any serious adverse effects that may occur during participation?
That's a part of informed consent. And so, in terms of the informed consent, there may be, in fact, some type of clause that will help to insure you. Everybody's different in terms of clinical trials. But again, that's a willing decision. So each participant has to understand the risk benefits of a clinical trial. All right. I mean, that's similar to any type of document. Before you sign up there, then you need to be clear that you understand the risk benefits of that. And a lot of times with any type of medication, there are benefits, but then also theoretically there can be, risk. And that should be clearly outlined before anyone puts their name on the dotted line.
Yeah. So that brings me to one point. I wanted to share a slide that gives some of the safety measures on clinical trials before we go.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just share this information. Just one second. So if you see, it just gives you the safety, some of the safety measures for clinical trials and the participants, along with the rights. Researchers and pharmaceutical companies that sponsor the trials must follow strict rules and ethical guidelines. Trials are reviewed and monitored by independent bodies called an Institutional Review Board, IRB, to ensure the trial is conducted ethically. The Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, also monitors trials and must approve the medicines before the public can use them. Researchers must follow a study plan called a protocol that outlines what will happen in the study. Participants must give permission by signing, and you made mention of this, a document called the Informed Consent Form, or ICF. And then also, if you decide to take part in the clinical trial, you can change your mind at any time and withdraw from the trial at any time. So again, these are some of the rights that the participant has with regards to clinical studies. And our job today was to discuss this information and to make sure that each individual is well informed with regards to the opportunity of clinical trials and just and knowing their rights.
Absolutely. So safety, safety, safety is the takeaway. That is the takeaway of clinical trials. Again, as mentioned, the informed consent is an opportunity for you to ask all your questions, get everything explained to you. The individual review board is, as mentioned before, an ethical group of individuals that are tasked with the oversight of the clinical trials. The FDA is not going to release anything until it's clear that it is safe. At any point in time, you can stop. This is not anything where anyone is holding you hostage. You can, at any point in time, stop. And so safety, 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 that's the takeaway of clinical trials.
So Dr. Douglas, Dr. Douglas, we have probably one time for one more question.
Okay.
The question comes in: who covers the participation costs, medicine, and treatment?
That's going to be the primary investigator and whoever is providing the resources to the primary investigator. So that's in the form of the pharmaceutical company, the university, if you will, the institution, perhaps through the federal government. They take care of that. I mean, that's going to be provided. In order to be able to begin a clinical trial, one has to put together, as mentioned before, a protocol, a study plan. It has to be approved, and it has to be approved in the form of financing. Someone has to, if you will, provide the resources. So that's something that it's already in play by the time you begin to hear about a clinical trial.
Wow. So once again, Dr. Douglas, great conversation, great discussion. I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for just bringing this topic to light and giving the information and the resources to our audience this evening. I also want to thank Black Health Matters, as well as JANSSEN Pharmaceuticals, Kappa Alpha Psi Fraternity Incorporated, who we love so much, so dear. The brothers of the Metropolitan Atlanta Coalition of Kappas, most affectionately known as the MAC, and the 10 chapters that represent the MAC. And then also as well, the All of Us Research Program, which encompasses us, the Divine Nine organizations that are all involved in this journey of trying to get the underrepresented population, mainly African Americans, involved with clinical studies and clinical trials. So again, thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. If you have any other questions, please see researchincludesme.com for more information on clinical trials and the importance of diversity and getting involved. So with that said, once again, thank you all for your time and good night.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.